Hello, everyone. I'd just like to start today by thanking the University of Chile and Paulina for organising this seminar series today and inviting us here. It's really exciting for me to be in Santiago. I've wanted to come here for a really long time, so thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm going to be talking today about multi-level governance for sea level rise and legitimacy and public preferences. And I'll say from the start, I like to say what my presentation is about so that if you forget everything, you remember one thing. What I want to get across today is that when it comes to governance, I think a lot of the barriers come from the fact that we don't understand well the political context of adaptation. And I think that that's across the board in many countries. And I think that we need to do more work on this, particularly these issues of legitimacy and what public preferences mean for how we structure our governance systems. So this talk today comes out of some work that I've done we completed last year with Professor John Barnett and myself on a nationally funded project called Barriers to Adaptation to Sea Level Rise. So I was really glad when Paulina did her introduction this morning that this will probably be on topic. I'm going to talk briefly about sea level rise in Australia and the governance responses that we're developing to that. And then I'm going to talk about this project and the findings from stage 1, which looked into the key barriers to adaptation across the board, not just for sea level rise. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the main part of our project, which was public preferences for multi-level governance for sea level rise. And lastly, I want to talk about some general lessons and conclusions for adaptation policy and research. And hopefully they might be able to cross over into some of the things that you're experiencing in Chile. And I'd really like to hear about those from you if we have time for discussion. All right, a bit about coastal management in Australia. Thanks. Australia has an extremely large amount of coastline. We've got about 10,000 beaches around the country. And already managing risks to this coastline is difficult. So we have many coastal management problems that include coastal erosion and flooding, as well as inundation from large storms. These hazards, combined with efforts to manage them, like seawalls and other engineering solutions, create large-scale risks for coastal ecosystems, housing, infrastructure, and also for the ability of people to enjoy the beach. We love the beach in Australia. We spend a lot of time there. And this is a photo just down here of a famous beach just outside of Melbourne that, due to coastal erosion, is now unusable. And let me tell you, this doesn't make people very happy at all. So these problems that we're already managing are really likely to be made worse by sea level rise, and we need to think about how we're going to deal with this extra level of difficulty. So, sea level rise governance in Australia. As with other countries around the world, this has become an extremely difficult public policy issue. And the vast majority of Australians live on the coast. But more importantly, from a risk perspective, about 6% of Australia's population lives within 3 kilometres of the shoreline and less than 5 metres above mean sea level. So there's a lot of people at risk under future sea level rise projections. Despite this risk, however, there remains a strong economic imperative to develop the coast and a powerful cultural pull to coastal living. Everybody wants to live on the coast and as close as possible, really. So our planning systems are really not designed to deal with the uncertainty and timeframes of sea level rise, and our planning systems haven't caught up to this yet. At a local government level, Australia is at a stage where we're beginning to implement adaptation policies. So some local governments have tried to implement retreat policies where they require houses like these ones, which as you can see are often owned by quite wealthy people, to move back once sea level rise hits a certain threshold. Other local government areas have tried to restrict development right on the coast. And there's some other adaptation strategies that they've tried. In many cases, and I would say almost most cases in Australia at the moment, this has caused political conflict and controversy in the communities where they've tried to implement these things. And in many of those cases, that controversy has meant that adaptation plans and programs have been abandoned at the next election. So if there's one thing that makes ministers nervous, I think around the world, it's local controversy and conflict. So I think this is really important and we need to acknowledge this in adaptation governance. And I'll talk a bit more about the importance of that in the next couple of slides. At a national level, and perhaps because of this, there's no clear framework for governance for adaptation to sea level rise in Australia. So government is still deciding on how roles and responsibilities across levels of government, the community, the private sector, need to be distributed. So in Australia, I guess we know that multi-level governance is important, but we don't know how to do it best yet. Okay, so in this context, we undertook the first stage of our project, and we wanted to know what was making governance for sea level rise so difficult. As Rod said, we're a country with high adaptive capacity. We've got an advanced liberal democracy. We've got quite a lot of resources for adaptation. Why are we still not moving on governance for sea level rise? So in other words, we wanted to know what the barriers were here. So we did a large-scale policy analysis and we had discussions with decision makers at local, state and federal levels. And at this stage of the project, we found two things. Firstly, the decision makers told us that the barriers were less about what to do to manage sea level rise. We have a lot of information on the options, but more about who should do what. And so uncertainty about responsibility was the key barrier in governance. Secondly, decision makers in government felt that they had a mandate barrier for adaptation. So in other words, they felt uncertain about what the public expects from government and what might cause political conflict when they tried to act. And this made them nervous, and then that made ministers nervous, and then that meant that there was a barrier there in terms of developing sophisticated governance programs. So we thought this second issue was really interesting. By asking what people want from their governance regimes, we're getting at this issue of legitimacy for multi-level governance. And we wanted to know if what people expected from different levels of government was what was actually happening in Australia. And if not, could this explain some of the political conflict that we've been seeing at local levels? So with that in mind, we wanted to understand community preferences for responsibility for adaptation to sea level rise. We chose two case study locations. Sorry, these maps aren't very good. They're both on the eastern side of Australia. And we chose them because they were both at high risk and had both these local government areas had experienced controversy about planning for sea level rise. So we conducted 80 in-depth hour-long interviews, or a lot of people like to talk about this, so they often went for 2 hours or longer. But in a range of small and large towns in these case study areas. And so we wanted, as I said, they were targeted interviews, so we wanted a sample that reflected the range of groups for whom sea level rise or adaptation is likely to matter. So we interviewed homeowners, business owners, community organisation leaders and coastal managers. And this is important that when you're doing this type of work, you talk to a range of people. The public is not just one group. And so we analysed the data like this. I can talk more about this later if you need. So what did we ask them about? In the interviews, we asked a range of things. We asked about opinions on coastal management now, opinions on the risk of sea level rise into the future, preferences for different types of adaptation responses, opinions on compensation as a policy instrument. That got a lot of discussion. And then the main part of the interview was this issue of responsibility. And we wanted to see if people's opinions on who should do what differed depending on what adaptation task was at hand. So we split adaptation into 5 main governance tasks: information provision, managing public assets, managing private assets, making adaptation plans, and bearing the costs of adaptation. So the report that we've produced, which I'll give you the link for later, has all of the details of the answers to each of these questions. So I won't go through all of that, but I'll just show you how we presented the data, because it's important for how you present information for decision makers and academic audiences. So first off, governments just wanted to know who thought what on an aggregate level. So we presented the data like this. This is the question of preferences for responsibility for cost bearing. And we also split it by homeowners and things like that. But while this tells us something about what these interviewees wanted from governments, it doesn't tell us why. And when we're thinking about principles for multi-level governance, the why is really important here. So we also did detailed qualitative analysis on the rationales for why people wanted one level or sector to be involved or not. And I can come back to these and talk a bit more about the whys if we need. But I'll look, so what did they want from government? This figure shows the majority responses for preferences for the allocation of tasks across the 3 levels of government. So at the local level here, you can see that the majority of people wanted people to manage public assets, that the local government to manage public assets, regulate decisions on private assets, and coordinate public input into local planning. At the other end of the scale, they wanted federal government to produce knowledge and provide information on the risks of sea level rise, and to bear the costs and coordinate funding for adaptation. Interestingly, in the middle here, they didn't see a strong role for state government, apart from a coordinating role between those 2 local and federal levels. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's very different from current regimes of governance for coastal management in Australia. Currently, the weight of responsibility for most of coastal management tasks sits here with state government. And the responsibility for bearing the costs of adaptation and making the on-ground decisions sits here with local government. And federal government, I'm out of the country so I can say it, doesn't do very much. So really I think the main point is that there is a big difference between what people want and what is actually happening in adaptation governance. So finally, some conclusions. What does this mean for multi-level governance and barriers to adaptation? At a theoretical level, I think this gap or mismatch between what people want and what's actually happening is really important. So I think when emerging governance structures and societal expectations don't match, we've got some major problems for adaptation legitimacy. And at a practical level, this lack of legitimacy can slow or stop good adaptation programs. And I think we need to think about that more. Secondly, it's not all bad, I don't think. I think that researchers can play a role here, and policymakers can think about investigating preferences before we establish our formal governance regimes. And I think that this might encourage more effective distribution of responsibility, but also, importantly for ministers, minimise political conflict on this issue, which then hopefully means that we can get some continuity in our adaptation plans and programs. And lastly, this is a point about research in adaptation generally. I think we need more empirical work on the political context and consequences of adaptation and multi-level governance. Often as researchers we tend to design beautiful models for governance and talk about it in journal articles and things like that, and completely ignore the fact that we live often in democracies where people's opinions count. For better or worse, what people want from governance matters. And if we misunderstand public preferences for adaptation, we risk political conflict that can be a barrier to good adaptation implementation. So public opinions are complex, and I just think much more empirical work needs to be done to understand them and how they affect multi-level governance. And I'd really like to hear of any work that's going on in Chile around this sort of thing, or to hear about the sort of political context of how adaptation implementation is working in Chile. So the report is available on the NCAF website, which is the national funding body, and the analysis that we did on adaptation barriers in Australia across all adaptation contexts is going to be published in Climatic Change in the next edition of Climatic Change. So thank you very much, and yes.